One student said, Professor Pleasance, if I had only 1 hour to live, I'd like to spend it in your class. Then I read on. The reason I say this, only in your class does an hour seem like an eternity. Now, another aspect of being involved in academia is students also provide extraordinarily interesting answers on exams. One of my favorites is, and I'll read this, it's hard to imagine somebody could actually make this up. Shakespeare wrote tragedies, comedies, and hysterectomies. I'm not sure how you get to that. Magellan, the great explorer, circumcised the earth. Circumcised, circumscribed, you can understand. My all-time favorite, words to live by. Abstinence is a good thing if practiced in moderation. I find that is an outstanding comment on life. And a friend of mine got this on an essay, his English professor. The girl tumbled down the stairs and lay prostitute at the bottom. And he wrote very quickly, you must learn to distinguish between a fallen woman and one who's merely slipped. Now, this has nothing to do with anything, but while I'm up. I was in Florida recently and I saw a policeman pulling over a speeder. And it reminded me of a story that's supposed to be absolutely true, and I thought it might appeal to this audience. There was a man who had celebrated his 82nd birthday. He went out and bought a brand new Porsche. So he decided, if I got a new Porsche, I have to try it out. So he gets on the interstate, he's going 120 miles an hour. Highway patrolman picks him up, lights flashing, siren on. Guy kept going. The cop chased him for about 30 miles. Finally pulled over. The cop went up to him and said, sir, you're driving 120 miles an hour. It's very, very dangerous. What do you got to say to me, sir? He said, well, sir, he said, it's my 82nd birthday. I'm reliving my youth. I'm having a great time, and I was so entranced with the car and the speed that I didn't realize you were behind me. And the cop said, well, I'll tell you what, if you give me an excuse I've never heard before, I'll let you off. And the guy said, 6 years ago, my wife ran off with a highway patrolman, and I thought you were bringing her back. And the cop said, have a nice day. So let me talk about Bletchley Park, and let me give you a little bit of background. I am definitely not an expert on Bletchley Park. I have read a few books, and I would mention these to you. This is the guidebook, which is very helpful. This is a book, the Bletchley Park Codebreakers. The best one probably, The Secrets of Station X by Michael Smith, and then Double Cross by Ben McIntyre. And I'll explain to you later what that's about. I had the opportunity last summer to spend a good portion of a day at Bletchley Park. A friend of mine is the CEO of the World War II Museum in New Orleans, and we were traveling to various World War II sites, and we got a chance to go to Bletchley Park. and we had a private tour, as it were, by the director of the museum. So we got to see quite a bit more than the average person would get to see. And I found it absolutely fascinating. I did not realize that they had taken Bletchley Park and had begun the process of making it into a first-class museum. They don't have much money. They waited until a later date. But once they get this thing organized, it is going to be fantastic. It's amazing to me. People did not know about Bletchley Park until 1974. Wow. Nobody knew what went on at Bletchley Park. Nobody told what they did. One individual said when he went, he was told to come to the rail station at Bletchley, report to Hut 6. He had no idea what that was about, no idea what he was doing. Once he got there and got his job, he said, I have not spoken about it for 50 years. I just did not tell anybody. And it's astonishing. 10,000 people at the height worked at Bletchley Park. And nobody gave out this incredible secret. They used to refer to Bletchley Most Secret Service, MSS. In 1992, some local historians realized they were going to completely tear down all the huts in the manor house and put up condos, of course. And so they decided that they would start a campaign to save it. And once they got started, they began to get attention, and the British government came in, and the defense industry gave them some help, and eventually have saved most of the buildings. Now, when we look at Bletchley Park, it is an extraordinary process that goes on in these huts and buildings. Essentially what they do is they decrypt all of the codes and the ciphers from the German military. That's what they do, essentially. What was fascinating to me is the achievements of Bletchley Park. Without question, it shortened the war by at least 2 years. It saved thousands and thousands of lives. If they only did one thing, fool the Germans about where the D-Day landing would be, that saved thousands of lives, just that alone. They had information that helped them sink the Bismarck. They had information that helped Montgomery at El Alamein. They had information that helped every theater of the war. They discovered the Germans were making V-1 and V-2 rockets. They knew how far the Germans had progressed in making atomic bombs. They knew when the Germans created a new U-boat and where it was made and when it was going to be put into service. They came up with all this information. Without this information, I think it would have been extraordinarily difficult to win the war. Now, the problem that they had is that they never quite could get all of the information they needed. Now, you can just imagine this. They had listening stations all over Britain. They were picking up the German radio signals, thousands and thousands. And they would bring them into Bletchley by teleprompter. And eventually they had to put an entire building that was just getting in the raw material. They would take that material and give it to the cryptographers. And they would take this information, and remember, it's in German, and encrypted. And they would take this information and work through it until they could get some plausible indication of what the Germans were going to do. Now, to give you some idea of how difficult this is, the German Enigma machine, and you have a picture of that right here, had 158 million permutations. They changed it every 24 hours. Later, when they worried about somebody breaking the code, they added another rotor. They had 3 rotors, they added 4 rotors. The Lorenz machine, the code machine, which was used by the German high command, used by Hitler, they had 12 rotors. The possibilities were in the billions. So you have this ciphered code coming to you, unbelievably complex. And so what they would do, the cryptographers, would get as much information as they could. They would pass it on to the next hut. And when they first built Bletchley, they just put it up. And so they were in these little wooden huts, not very sophisticated at all. As a matter of fact, when Hut 6, where the cryptographers were, they would send it to Hut 3. They would put it in a basket on a wire and take a broom and push it over to the next hut and say, message coming. Later, of course, they got to the point when they had pneumatic tubes and they could transfer that information electronically. It was pretty basic when they started out. Now, in the Hut 3 were the analysts. And they had the really difficult job because all of this information was partial information, it was not exactly clear. So they had to have scientists, they had to have linguists, they had to have all kinds of people who could figure out a coherent military purpose for this information. So you would get information, but you would have to get something that would be usable. And it had to be done in 24 hours. If it wasn't done then, it was too late. You had to start all over again. And when they first started, they didn't have a lot of people. Eventually, when they got 10,000, they had 3 shifts. So Bletchley Park went 24 hours a day. So there were 3,000 in each shift working constantly. Then the analyst would come up. It had to be clear, had to be accurate, had to be prompt, had to be correctly translated. They would pass that information on to the next level. And then at the next level, they would take that information and determine where they needed to send it to the correct military, whether it was the RAF, whatever. They would take that information and then they could somehow figure out where to send that. In order to send out the information, it had to be encrypted. Obviously, because they want the Germans intercepting what they had. Sometimes they would use something they called a one-time pad. They'd have a one-time code. They would just use it one time and then they'd destroy it. So they would send that information out to the military and hopefully they would be able to use that. When they started, they had to make sure that the Germans never knew that the code was broken. So none of the sources ever referred to Bletchley. Bletchley is never mentioned. It is a reliable source. What they figured out to do, and this is absolutely brilliant, they decided the way to fool the Germans was to have material from Bletchley come from spies. So they created this imaginary, fictional spy system. And this spy would give the information out. So if the Germans came across it, they wouldn't know it came from Bletchley. The Germans never found out. Well, I don't know how They kept it a secret all the time. The Germans were so arrogant, they thought they could never break it. They said, nobody can break this code. In fact, we'll talk about this a little later, Admiral Dönitz, who was head of the U-boats, at sort of 42, the U-boats were destroying Allied shipping at a horrendous rate, and all of a sudden, they weren't so successful because they had broken the enigma, the naval code. And by the way, the Army, the Luftwaffe, the Navy, they all had different codes. They'd broken it, and Dönitz went to his experts. He said, "You've broken the code." And they said, "No, we can't do it. It cannot be done." The only time there was any breach was a man named John Cairncross, who for reasons difficult to understand, did smuggle out information, but he gave it to the Russians. And the Russians, of course, never gave it to the Germans. So the Germans never found out. And until the end of the war, they believed that their code was unbreakable. And that's a pretty extraordinary process to manage that under such difficult conditions. A couple of interesting little points. When they first started, they selected the site in 1938, and it was a perfect site. It was an old manor house owned by a family, and you can see, I think there might be one picture of the manor house. That was the headquarters. It was away from London. They knew London was going to be bombed during the war, so they didn't want the code breakers in London. It was equidistant between Oxford, Cambridge, and London, because almost all of the early code breakers came from Oxford and Cambridge. So it was out in the country. It was rather pastoral. People would not suspect that this was where the code breakers were. One of the early workers for M16, which is of course British intelligence, known then as the Secret Intelligence Service, was a guy named Ian Fleming, who was the liaison between M16 and Bletchley. To give you a couple examples of the people, there was a guy named Dilly Knox. I love these names. Dilly Knox and Nobby Clark, who were two of the great code breakers. Both went to Eton. Both went to King's College, Cambridge. Now that's about as good a representation of the British upper class as you get. So most of these people who were in code were British upper class, very highly educated. Now, as they begin the process of trying to break the Enigma machine had been, to some degree, already broken by Polish mathematicians. They had literally built an Enigma machine, although they didn't have one. They kind of figured out how it worked and had developed their own machine, and they began the process of breaking the code. Now, when you look at the Enigma machine, what they did, it has a, you can see it, it's in a little wooden box, and it's like a typewriter. It's like a QWERTY keyboard. And so what the operator would do, he would hit, for a plain text message, he would hit an A. And then at the top, there's this little lamp box, and a M would light up. Then the rotors would change that 5, 6, 7 times. So what started as an A might end up as an R. And the more times you change that letter, the harder it was to break that code. And so when you get millions and millions of possibilities, it's hard to figure out how you can actually get that information. Now, one of the problems that the Germans had, and I guess this is true of everybody, at the end of almost all of the reports, they would have something like nothing else to report, or nothing to report. Well, if you were going to break the code and you looked at the bottom every time, and you saw those same letters, you knew right away, okay, we got these letters, nothing to report. The operators often signed on with the same signal all the time. In fact, there was one who used his girlfriend's initials, and they learned that. So every time they saw this guy, they knew KRS, or whatever his girlfriend's initials were, they had that broken. So the way they broke them was what they called a crib. You remember the old sort of when you wanted to cheat on the exam, you had a little crib sheet. So they had a crib that would say nothing to report. So they started out, they knew those letters as a start, and they would work from there. But of course the thing is so tedious, it takes so long, and when they were doing it on an individual basis, it took forever to try to get all of the permutations and the possibilities. It was just too slow. So the key is going to be a man named Alan Turing, who is an extraordinary genius. A very sad story about Alan Turing. This is very recent. He was gay, and after the end of the war, he was arrested for homosexual behavior, and at a very young age committed suicide. And the reason I bring this up is about a month ago, Queen Elizabeth pardoned him after all of these years. Now, he is a brilliant but eccentric mathematician. He put all the money he had into gold ingots, buried it, but forgot where he buried it. Lost the direction. Every day he would ride in on his bicycle with a gas mask. Well, there was no gas at Bletchley Park, who knows? And then there's a picture of his coffee cup chained to the radiator. Not quite sure why he did that. But this guy was a genius. What he is going to do is literally invent the first computer. He realized that you've got millions and millions and millions of combinations. The individual mind can't work fast enough to figure out all the possibilities. So literally, there were no computers. We had adding machines, things like that, but no computers. He invented what is essentially the first computer. Now, he called it a bomb. And as you look on you'll see that there are several pictures of the bomb. B-O-M-B-E. And they called it a bomb because all of the rotors were ticking. You could hear it tick, 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 tick. So it ticked like a bomb, so they called it a bomb. And what the bomb could do is they would get the daily Enigma settings, and it could essentially, with these cribs, eliminate a lot of incorrect answers and narrow down the possibilities, which you couldn't do. The human mind could not operate that fast. And these things were huge. They were 6.5 feet high, 7 feet wide, 2.5 feet deep. And as you can see, each Enigma machine had 30 of these rotating drums, and the drums all the letters of the alphabet on each drum. Each bomb, this is astonishing to me, had 10 miles of wire. 1 million soldered connections. Now, who comes up with a machine like this? I had a guy spent about an hour lecturing me on how the bombs work. I remember absolutely nothing and understood less. And I said, what kind of mind could come up with this? He said, one in a century. Nobody had a base from which to work. He built the first bomb in 3 months. 3 months. You know, people tell me about a computer, this little chip, you can hold 6 books. No, not on that little chip. That's not possible. But in his mind, he realized that if he could create this machine that would enable him to get a better and faster way of breaking the code, he would be successful. Now, eventually, they ended up, they had one room with all of these bombs. They had 120 bombs. They had to build new buildings for all the bombs. And as they built them, they got better. And they got bigger. And they were referred to as jumbos. So they could process faster and faster. And ultimately, they ended up building what I guess is really the first of the computers. It is called the Colossus. And I'll just read you the description. The world's first large-scale electronic digital computer. There were billions of possible combinations to the Lorentz code, billions. By the end of the war, they could break the code in 30 minutes. And by the end of the war, there were 10 of these Colossus machines, all of them operating so fast that once they had this crib, these machines, so they could not have broken Enigma without the bomb. They could not have done it. It was just, and of course, as the war goes on, and they add new rotors and they use the Lorentz more, it becomes more and more difficult. So they couldn't have done it without these. Now, let me mention a little bit about the group who worked here. Again, 10,000 people, 2/3 women. And none of them lived there. The only people who lived there was some military police who guarded it, and there were some custodians and that sort of thing. Everybody else lived off of Bletchley Park. It was very carefully controlled about who came and when. But they came in every day on their shift. And the main headquarters was, again, the mansion. And there they had the telephone exchange and offices and that sort of thing. And they finally built a cafeteria. Now, you've got 10,000 people. So the cafeteria's open all 24 hours, and they usually do 1,000 at a time. And so but the staff ate in the dining room. Right. The upper echelon could not be at a cafeteria. It was beneath their status. The big problem is they were so isolated in terms of what they did. One hut did not know what went on in the other hut. They never interacted. They never went into the other huts. So one group didn't know what was going on with this other group. They just did their job and passed it on. So they needed recreation. You can imagine the tense situation trying to break this code. You need to break it in order to save lives. You don't have a lot of time. It's difficult. It's a lot of pressure. So they decided that they had to have some relaxation. So they had games and cricket, the world's most boring sport, plays, concerts, musicals, theatrical productions, bridge, chess. You know, they wanted to have entertainment so they could get involved. There was one man who was sort of in charge of entertainment. His name was Bryn Newton-John, and he had a rather well-known daughter. Yes. And he thought that the best way to help lessen the stress was to have some films and plays and all that sort of, it was very, very helpful. This is one, oh, they had a great library, a lot of people could read. It was rather awful during the middle of the war. We had to be there, it was an emergency, we all put our hearts into it, but I think we all enjoyed being there. And they understood what their job was and how important it was. The most important thing, I think, for all of this, was by 1941, Winston Churchill went for a visit. He instantly knew how important it was. He told everybody, whatever they want, you get it, and you get it now. Anything they want. This is so critical to the war. Prior to that time, nobody paid much attention to them until they got Churchill on board. And the initial information they sent out, now remember, this is not coming from Bletchley Park. It's coming from some spy somewhere, right? So the Navy in particular paid no attention to them. Well, I don't know how reliable this is. I'm not going to risk my people's lives based on this information. And they couldn't tell them, look, this is really good information. We broke it in German code. Couldn't tell them that. So they lost a lot of lives because they didn't in the beginning. Once they figured it out, then, of course, it was a great source. If you just, Battle of Britain, they worked out the communication between the German flight controllers and the planes. They knew when they were coming, where they were coming, and how many.